Hello and welcome to the latest video. I'm Fiona Mullen from Sapienta Economics. Today I'm going to be looking at public sector employment, doing a little bit of myth busting. How much is it as a percentage of total employment? How much is it as a percentage of government spending? And how much is public sector as a percentage of GDP? So what do people say? You often hear people saying, oh, the public sector is 50% of all employment. Or you hear that public sector is 30% of the entire economy, 30% of GDP. The International Monetary Fund, our bosses during the bailout time, they are worried about it. They're saying it's high compared to peers. We'll go on to that in a moment. But let's have a look at the statistics. So how big is the public sector? Let's have a look. It is indeed larger than it has ever been. In 2024, the statistical service CyStat tells us that it was 75,353. Now that's people who are getting money every month from the government. That's important because there's different ways of measuring employment. So for sure it's higher than it's ever been. And you can see when you look at the different categories that the one that looks like it's been growing the most is the one that they call non-profit organisations. Now I think that's semi-government organisations like, for example, the Human Resources Development Authority. And indeed, if you compare the level in 2024 with the level in 2009, the one that has grown the most is the non-profit organisations, what I assume is semi-government organisations. That's grown by 5,813. The central government has also grown quite a lot, 3,061. But the publicly owned enterprises, and I think that means the Electricity Authority of Cyprus, the Cyprus Telecommunications Authority, the dominant telecoms provider, and possibly the Ports Authority, they have actually shrunk. So how much is public sector employment as a percentage of the total? Not as big as you might think. So it's 15.5% in 2004. It did rise from 15.3%, but it's nowhere near as big as it was in 1999. Why? So the total number has risen, but total employment has risen even faster. That's why. Now, a couple of caveats about this figure. First of all, watch out, I have squashed the scale here, right? And I did that because it shows the changes more dramatically. But you should watch out when economists do this. They might be trying to hide something, okay? And the second thing is that this is employment on the labour force basis. So this is total employment as measured on the basis of a labour force survey, which is conducted every quarter. The CyStat people go out and they survey a representative sample of households, and from that they come up with a number for employment, unemployment and so on. And the public sector employment number is that 75,000 that I told you before. Why am I saying this? Because there's another way of measuring employment. It's called the national accounts basis. It's on a full-time working equivalent basis. So it's not just the number of checks, so to speak, that the government writes every month. It is full-time equivalent, plus no doubt other fancy adjustments that only statisticians know about. And on that basis, public sector employment is 20% of total employment. Again, employment measured on national accounts basis. And the public sector employment measure that I've used here, because I'm going to compare later with other EU countries, is public administration and defence. That's O in the national accounts codes. Education, which is P, plus healthcare, human healthcare, which is Q. Okay, and I'm using that because later I will compare with other EU countries. But on that basis, really, it hasn't changed much. It would average out at about 20% of total employment. Okay. So what's the summary so far? In terms of absolute numbers, yes, public sector employment is at an all-time high. This has been driven by the semi-government organisations, assuming I got that category correct. But it's shrunk as a percentage of total employment, at least until 2023, and only when measured on the labour force basis. Okay. Now, what about spending? So for spending, it's actually easier to go to Eurostat because the CyStat comes in months and you have to spend a long time to get your annual figures. So yes, again, this is euro billions. It's at an all-time high. It reached 3.9 billion in 2024. This is spending on compensation of employers, which, by the way, includes pensions. As a percentage of total spending, however, it's not as high as it has been in the past. The earliest data we have here is 35% of total spending by the government on everything. And it actually reached a low point in 2014, and 2018, that's a bit of an anomaly because the government spent a lot on the co-op in that year. But we can see that, yes, it did go up last year, and that's a bit of an uncomfortable climb. You wouldn't really want that rising at the same pace. So it went from 27.4% in 2023 to 29% of total spending in 2024. So what are the issues? Well, the IMF talks about the problem of you've got actually quite a low labour force as a percentage of employment, but you've got quite a high spending as a percentage of GDP. Let me show you the figures here. So what does it mean? Public sector employment as a percentage of total in Cyprus is actually in the bottom half of the EU countries. So it's 19.7% of total employment. In the EU average is 24.1%, and the highest is actually Sweden at 33.9% of total employment. And again, that's the same, the public sector, education and healthcare, okay? But it's in the top half of payroll as a percentage of GDP. So how much is the government spending on these employees is in the top half. It's 11.5% for Cyprus, and 14.2% is the highest for Denmark. And poor old Ireland is down at 6.2%. What else does the IMF talk about? We really have an equity issue. I spoke about this in another video, but I will revisit it when we get the full figures for 2024. So public sector workers in Cyprus earn 27% more on average than their private sector counterparts, once you account for education and so on. That's an issue of equity, fairness, justice, especially in the context of people not being able to pay their energy bills. We also have what's called crowding out issue, and that's where essentially all the talent gets sucked into the public sector and leaves the private sector high and dry because the conditions and the pay are so good in the public sector, right? And yet, despite that, the IMF says that measures of government effectiveness in Cyprus is lagging other advanced economies. So you have all these overqualified people, but owing to bad management and a lot of politics and so on, they're not working as well and as efficiently as they could. So we have a quality issue as well. Finally, how big is the public sector as a percentage of GDP? What's its share in the total economy? If you just take the very narrow definition, which is just the public sector, so just the O in the national accounts, it's only 7.6% of GDP, okay? If you take the broader definition that Eurostat was using, then it's 16% of GDP. So it's fairly large. So to sum up, when we're looking at jobs as a percentage of total employment, it's 15.5% if you measure it on the labour force basis, or 20% if you measure it on a national accounts basis. It was shrinking as a percentage of total employment until 2023. Public sector payroll as a percentage of government spending on everything, 29%. That's pretty high, but it was fairly stable again until 2023. Public sector payroll as a percentage of GDP, 11.5%. It has been falling. The peak was 14.7% in 2012. It was 2012 when we had all of these cuts in the public sector, not actual cuts in headcount, but net income declined because of a whole bunch of things that were sliced off and then finally given back again. Public sector output, so what is the public sector as a share of the economy? 16%, and that's actually at an all-time low. But we have equity problems, we have crowding out problems, we have quality issues, and as I talked about in another video, we have productivity issues as well. That's it from me. It's my shameless plug for my flagship Sapienta Country Analysis Cyprus. Every month I do a really deep dive into all of the aspects of the economy and the politics of Cyprus, including Northern Cyprus. You can find more about that on my website, or if your budget is much smaller, you can get just the executive summary of Country Analysis Cyprus for just $100 a year at cypruspocketbrief.substack.com. Thank you for listening. Just popping in here to say that the wonderful people at Cystat got back to me, and yes, my assumptions about the semi-government organisations and public companies like the Electricity Authority were correct. So thank you, Cystat.